In my opinion, powerlifting is a very easy sport to start. Although, like every other sport, once you get to the top level, things become much more complicated, but in order to just start your powerlifting career, it's actually pretty straightforward. I started powerlifting at 22 years old, and I don't know any sport that you can start this old and actually accomplish good things in it. If we take some other examples like basketball or football, you can't really make much if you start at 22 or 23. But in my case, while I did start at 22, I ended up becoming 2 times world champion in powerlifting. So my goal is to give you guys the most complete guide I can provide for you in order to start your powerlifting career in 2025. This video will be segmented with different sections, so let's say you're interested in the equipment section, you can directly find the time code just under this video. The first section is how to start powerlifting. I know there's this idea that in order to start powerlifting, you need to have a given muscle baseline. And for me, that's a pretty wrong way to view it, because let's take a quick example. If you want to start basketball, you don't first start a track and field career. You immediately start basketball, and while you're developing your skills at maneuvering the ball or at making passes, stuff like that, shooting the ball, at the same time, you also go to refine the other qualities that you need in order to become a good basketball player. And that's actually the same with powerlifting. You can start your powerlifting career as long as you step foot into the gym. You don't need 2, 3, 4 years of lifting weights before being able to start powerlifting. Obviously, if you have this background like I did when I started, that will be much helpful, because then the muscle building phase will be easier to do. But you can start immediately your career with powerlifting. And the reason also is that the powerlifting movements are generally accepted as very good muscle building movements. Like if you take some very good bodybuilders, most of them, they do some squats, they do some bench, or they do some deadlift. So saying that powerlifting is not a good sport to build muscle is, in my opinion, pretty wrong. And obviously, if you have a good management of your pure powerlifting work and also your muscle building accessories, then you do get the best of both worlds and you can immediately start with powerlifting. Another thing I wanted to say about how do you really start powerlifting, like I said, you just step foot in the gym, start to do some squats, some bench, some deadlift. And also, in my opinion, it's important to immediately start with the sport to actually see if you enjoy it. Because, powerlifting is a pretty repeatable sport because you're mostly focusing on 3 movements, just like some other sports, but you have to make sure that's a sport you actually could be enjoying. So instead of second guessing, oh, I'll start by doing 2 years of general lifting weight, and then I'll start doing the movement, immediately start with the movement. The sooner, the better. And also then you'll be able to know if that's actually a sport you want to invest in. On to the second segment of this video, which will be about programming. So I just want to do a quick disclaimer. Programming for any sport, so powerlifting is one of those, is very, very individualized. So I'll try my best to give some general advice that would and could work for 99.9% of you guys, but some of you may be an exception, and some of the general recommendations I'm going to make won't be 100% for them. So just keep that in mind. Those are the recommendations that I gathered after 8 years of being a powerlifting coach and as many years as a high-level athlete. So it's probably solid advice, but you may be one of the exceptions where those advice could apply a bit differently to you. Strength is specific. What does it mean is if you want to become stronger, let's say on bicep curls, you have to do bicep curls. If you want to become stronger on dumbbell rows, practicing dumbbell rows will be one of the best ways to become stronger on that. So the same goes for your squat, your bench, and your deadlift. In order to develop strength on those movements, you have to have a specific approach. What does it mean? It means that you must do some squats, some bench, some deadlift on a weekly basis. Now, in terms of general recommendations for squats, I would recommend between 2 and 3 squats. So 1 squat may not be enough, and above 3 squats may be an overkill for most of the lifters. But between 2 and 3 is, I think, a sweet spot for your squat. For bench, I would recommend between 3 and 4. So below 3, that might not be enough to drive those specific strength adaptations, and above 4 may be a bit too much, especially in terms of recovery. So between 3 and 4 bench press sessions a week. And finally, for deadlifts, that's the movement that takes most of the time to recover from. That's the most taxing movement from powerlifting. So usually for deadlifts, we have a lower frequency. And so for deadlifts, I would recommend between 1 and 2 deadlift sessions every week. The way we train powerlifting nowadays, what is quote unquote meta, is to do some training blocks. So a training block is like just a sequence of training, and it could go from 3 weeks up to 8, 10, 12 weeks. Usually from my own experience and the way I personally coach athletes is I most often do between 3 and 6 weeks training block. The goal of the powerlifting block is to start at a given level and end up at a higher level. And so in order to make that happen, what we most of the time do is we start the block with room left in the tank on every movement. So if you start your block and you're already at max output, max effort, first, the recovery will be very, very hard to do. And also you won't really able to grow into your block. If you start week 1 RM squat, bench, deadlift, how do you improve on the coming weeks? Most of the time, if you start very, very high, the more you progress into your weeks of training, the more things start to lower. And in reality, we want the opposite to happen. We want to start at a given level and grow into our block and be able to finish higher than we started the block. And one very good way to do so is, like I said, leaving room in your tank, especially at the beginning of the block. And then as we go week by week by week into the block, that's actually where we're going to increase some training variables. And just to name a few, one of those could be volume. So you start, let's say, with like 5 tons of volume, and week 2 you're at 7 tons of volume, and week 3 you're at 8.5, 9, etc. So you have this slow build of volume. And another variable that we usually play with in any powerlifting block is actually intensity. We also want to increase intensity because, like I said, strength being a very specific way to train in order to become stronger as a powerlifter, you need to have those more specific intensities. And so you want to start at a given intensity and climb also your way up. So most of the time, that's the 2 variables with which we're going to play. So volume, increasing volume over weeks, but also not necessarily in conjunction. You could just increase volume without touching at the intensity, but you could also increase intensity on its own or a bit of both at the same time. My recommendation is do not try to increase both very substantially at the same time. So don't go crazy with volume and intensity every week after every week. So just to give you a quick example for you guys to make sure you understand that, let's say you start your block with a single RPE6 or roughly 88% of your 1 RM. That will be your work for week 1. And then from the RPE6 from week 1, you go to RPE 7.5 for week 2, which is roughly 91 to 92% of your 1 RM. And then week 3, you bump that up once more and you go from 7.5 to maybe 8.5. And that would more or less be around 95% of your 1 RM, and so on and so forth. So ideally, you start your block at a given point, and by the weeks, you increase that point, which hopefully will lead to strength gains, and you usually are able to end up your block a bit higher than you had started. Now you've understand how we usually shape the training programs for powerlifting. What do we actually do in any given training week? Because you understood the general ideas, but how do we train powerlifting in reality? So the way I usually do it, me personally as a coach and also for myself as an athlete, is I used a form of periodization. But instead of having a periodization over different blocks, training blocks, I usually have this periodization over the course of a week. So for instance, you'll start your week with 1 day for squats, for example, where you have this high intensity practice training. So let's say you'll have heavy triples to do. So a triple RP8, for instance, which would be close to 88% of your 1 RM. And that will be a day where the key will be to have this highly specific training. And then because you had this day with this type of training, this style of approach, then on the other day, you'll have a different thing to train. So for instance, that will be volume. So instead of doing triples very heavy, you'll do much lighter sets with like more reps. So maybe 6 reps or 7 reps, where instead of being very, very high in terms of intensity, you'll be at a much more moderate intensity. intensity, but accumulating more volume on this training session. And so by doing so, you actually end up having the best of both worlds, because you have a very, very highly specific way to develop your skills as a powerlifter, and at the same time, you do accumulate a lot of volume, which will be very important for muscle growth, but also that will be important for developing other skills. Because if you're doing 6 reps for every set in terms of accumulating a pattern for any given movement, so whether it be squats, whether it be bench, whether it be deadlift, that will be very, very efficient. And also in terms of recovery, that's probably one of the best ways to manage your body and manage your overall recovery. That's a moment where I quickly want to plug in my own personal coaching services. So if you want to follow a powerlifting program that I written on a training app that will calculate everything for you, so you just type in your 1 RM squat, bench, deadlift, and then you simply follow whatever the app tells you to follow. And again, like I said, that's based off of my own personal training programs. You can click the link in the description and go to thepanache.app, where you'll be able to access over 15 training programs for just 1 monthly subscription. And at the moment this video is out, there's actually a brand new powerlifting program and also a bench only program. So go to thepanache.app in order to be able to follow those. But at the same time, for those of you guys that want an individualized coaching, I have my coaching team that is ready to welcome you on board. So if you want to become one of our direct athletes, there's another link in the description. You'll have a couple of things to submit, so your name, your goals, your email address, and then by doing so, you'll be contacted by our team in order to be coached by us. So make sure you either follow the training app or do your submission in order to become one of the athletes. And now we're back to the video. So now I just want to do a quick summary of what I just said, because it may be a lot of information to digest at first, but in general, my number one recommendation would be do specific stuff. If you want to become stronger on your squat, practice your squat. If you want to become stronger on the bench, practice the bench, and so on and so forth. Number 2 is use a form of periodization into your training. So do not always train crazy heavy, do not never train heavy, have a bit of both. So having some heavy training, having some more moderate training, having some high volume approach, having a lower volume approach, but make sure to tackle all of those aspects as they all combine into making you a better athlete overall. Number 3, leave yourself some room in order to be able to grow into your training blocks. Do not start crazy high because you won't be able to actually progress that, but also don't start too low because you could be leaving some gains you could be making. Number 4, don't be afraid to lift heavy. Lifting heavy is part of powerlifting. Imagine a 100-meter runner that's afraid to go fast, to run fast. No, that's the goal. You just don't simply do that all the time, 100% of the time, but you have to be able to make some of that training. Otherwise, you won't be able to grow into the sport and develop the qualities that are required for the given sport. Number 5, variations and accessories are useful tool as a powerlifter. When I say train in a specific way, it doesn't mean don't do anything else. It means most of what you do has to be oriented towards your squat, your bench, your deadlift, but having to develop some other qualities on the side could be and is usually pretty helpful. But the video would be 1.5 hours long if I was to say everything about variations and accessories. So if that's a topic you're interested in, make sure to let me know in the comments, and that will definitely be a video I'll make in the future. Now on to the third segment of the video, which will be about the powerlifting equipment. Up until that point, I talked mostly about how do you actually get into powerlifting, which is again very simple. Just go to the gym, start to do some squats, some bench and deadlift. Hey, you became a powerlifter. Also, we talked about some programming ideas and strategies in general. We could go much deeper into that, but again, that would be a more than an hour-long video. So just I think those general ideas will be enough for you to start your journey. Now we're going to talk about the equipment, because the equipment is essential in any sport. If you want to properly practice a sport, in my opinion, you have to be aware at least of the equipment, what it does, and in order to know if that's something you could be interested in. Since I personally love these, and I think in general internet loves these, we're going to do a tier list in order to know which is the best equipment and which is the maybe not as useful equipment for powerlifting. But before I do it, 2 things. Number 1, you have to know the only absolutely mandatory required equipment in order to compete in powerlifting is a singlet, a pair of socks, and a pair of shoes. So just to say it quickly, you just need those 3 elements in order to compete. So all of the other elements, such as belt, for instance, the knee sleeve, stuff like that, that's not mandatory. That's helpful. That's something I would definitely encourage all of you guys interested in the sport to learn about and to probably buy in order to make the best out of your training sessions and your competitions. But in general, you can start powerlifting on a very, very low budget. A singlet, pair of socks, pair of shoes, you're good to go. Number 2 is I want to be upfront with something. When I started powerlifting, I wasn't sponsored by any brand. So I just, tried a couple of brands here and there, and that's how I encountered the SBD brand, the SBD apparel brand. And I immediately fell in love with their products because as an athlete, that's the best products out there. And that's the only products I trust personally in order to support me during my training sessions, but also my competitions. That's why I use their belt at any competition almost since I started powerlifting. So whether it's local level, national level, international level, when I won Worlds in 2021, 2023, I was using their belt, I was using their knee sleeves. Well, I think you get the point. That's a brand I really, really respect. And I think they have the best equipment out there. But since I started powerlifting, I'm now sponsored by SBD. So I think that's a tie I just wanted to be upfront with you guys about. I started using their equipment before any of that, but now I'm a sponsored athlete, and I wanted you to keep that in mind during this tier list because maybe some of you guys want to have some alternates in terms of brand, and that's completely fine. But that's also my role to tell you what I think is the best equipment. And just keep in mind, this whole tier list is going to be based off of the SBD products because that's the only equipment that I use, and that's the only equipment I really recommend. Here I gathered some of the most usual equipments we see in powerlifting. So you have the belt, you have the elbow sleeves, you have the knee sleeves, and I'm going to do a tier list with every one of those equipments. So we start with the S tier. In the S tier, I have the powerlifting belt, the SBD belt. And I'll be upfront, that's the only equipment I personally have in my S tier because the belt is just this type of equipment. The thing with the belt is most of people don't really understand what the belt does. The belt is not here to brace for you. The belt is not here to protect your low back. The belt is here for you to be able to maximize your intra-abdominal pressure, which will then lead to 2 things. Number 1, if you have better intra-abdominal pressure, you do lower the risk of injuries on squats and deadlifts. And also with better intra-abdominal pressure, you have usually better technique repeatability, and also you can lift much more weight. So the belt is not a magical tool that does those things for you. The belt is a tool that helps you support and improve your own intra-abdominal pressure. To put it up simply, if you don't know how to brace, then the belt won't do much for you. If you do know how to brace, then the belt will act like almost a superhero suit, right? It will be very, very helpful. So that's why I do recommend you check out the SBD belt, which is a fantastic piece of equipment. And like I said, that will be the only equipment S tier, which means that's the equipment I highly, highly, highly recommend for any of you guys watching this video. And I'll say something quickly. I know some people, and I was guilty of that, will say, hey, as long as I don't squat 200 kilos or 400 and something pounds, then I'm not good enough to wear a belt. But that's not the way to view at it, because if you start a sport, you want to be able to develop yourself as much as possible. And you do that with the best programming, you do that with the best movement you're able to produce, you do that with the best techniques, you do that with the best of everything. That's actually how you can really improve. And if you want the best program, if you want the best technique, why don't you want the best equipment at the same time in order to be able to grow in the most efficient way in a sport you're actually interested in? Following the S tier, we have the A tier. And at the top of the A tier, which is probably A plus, I would say, but still in the A tier, not quite in the S tier, I have the knee sleeves. So the knee sleeves are, in my opinion, a very, very good equipment that allow for improved support at your knees. And if you're squatting 2 times, 3 times, sometimes even 4 times any week and squatting somewhat heavy, I think they're a very, very good way to manage joint fatigue, because sometimes your muscles can recover from that, sometimes your central nervous system can recover from that, but the recovery capacity of joint is actually sometimes a bit lower. So in order to allow for a better joint management and joint recovery, using a pair of knee sleeves can be very, very helpful. Now, in terms of pure strength, I don't know how much these add, to be honest with you, but I would say it's probably around 10 kilos, 15 kilos of weight added. And it's not necessarily a weight added just in terms of mechanics, because as you can see, it's pretty flexible, right? It's not made out of a crazy material. It's neoprene, right? But the thing is, when you wear those and you're about to squat, you feel your knees so much supported that mentally it creates something where you're feeling very, very stable, you're feeling very comfortable. And that's, I think, in my opinion, why the knee sleeves, quote unquote, give you this much support in the squat. It's not just purely mechanics, it's mostly, I would say, mental. And you probably know it, but feeling strong mentally is very important in order to be actually strong physically, right? I don't think it creates this much support as the belt does, but it's still a pretty useful tool. And I think every good powerlifter should squat using a pair of knee sleeves. So for me personally, I like to size down. So my recommendation on the SBD website is to wear a small size, and I wear extra small size because I don't have crazy big calves, so it's easy to put them on. So if that's your first ever pair of knee sleeves, I would recommend you take your size or just one size down. But if you're an experienced lifter, then you can try maybe one size down, two sizes down. But yeah, I think the knee sleeves are pretty useful equipment, and that's why it's at the top of my A tier. In the A tier, I have the wrist wraps. The wrist wraps do two things actually. They first allow you to create a better stable position for your wrist, and then they allow you to lock in this position. And the way you're wearing wrist wraps is actually you don't wear them just below your wrist, because as you can see here, my wrist doesn't do anything and it's just free to move anywhere. The wrist wrap is supposed to be worn here. So at the junction between the end of your forearm and your wrist, it's supposed to stabilize and lock in those positions. As you can see, my wrist doesn't move a lot now compared to here, where it can move. So if you use wrist wraps, make sure you put them on properly in order to make the most out of them. And for the SBD wrist straps, I use them personally for squats because since I have a low bar squat, that's very helpful to stabilize this upper body position. And also I do wear them occasionally on bench press, because on the bench press, they will really allow me to have a good feeling of the bar into my hand. And if you saw this previous video where I talked about the importance of having a stable wrist position and also a good positioning of the hand in your palm, you'll understand how important wrist straps can be also for the bench press. In terms of what to take, I usually recommend these wrist straps, which are the flexible. As you can see, they're not very, very stiff. They're quite flexible, medium, and I think they're the most versatile wrist straps that will be useful for 99.9% of you guys. We're still in the A tier, and in this tier, I have a pair of Olympic weightlifting shoes. So the reason as to why I think this is still A tier is because a lot of people don't really understand the simple mechanics of squats. When I say simple, I don't mean it's simple in terms of how to execute that. That's actually pretty complicated, but I mean in terms of like just the movement itself is quite straightforward. And these allow for better mobility at the ankle, which is called also dorsiflexion, and that's a way to really have a very knee dominant squat. So now the knee dominant squat is not probably the strongest in terms of just pure force output style of squatting, because having a low bar squat, which will have a much more important involvement of your posterior chain, will probably be better in terms of pure strength output, just pure force output. But at the same time, in terms of understanding the movement, I think, especially if you're a complete beginner to the sport, trying out a pair of Olympic weightlifting shoes is a good way to have your first squats. So that's how I started squatting. And now, since then, I actually acquired the required mobility on my ankles to squat without those, but I do believe they're a pretty good way to start the movement. In terms of recommendation, I would definitely recommend this pair right here, which is called the Powerlift. And the reason as to why I recommend this pair is because, as you can see, so the drop, so which is the height of the heel, is not crazy high. And I think in terms of just understanding the movement, this is probably also the most versatile pair of squatting shoes, and that will be helpful for 99.9% of you guys out there. So if you're struggling on the execution of the movement, just give this pair a go. But yeah, pretty useful, still in the A tier. We're still in the A tier, and I have a pair of slippers. So I'll explain to you what the slippers do. So that's actually my brand, Sound Worker. So if you do want to support me and try out these slippers, make sure you go in the link in the description and grab yourself a pair of those. But those slippers, as you can see, they have a grippy sole. And the grippy sole is very, very important in two instances. On the bench press, when you're pushing with your feet against the ground, if you're wearing, for instance, a pair of Olympic weightlifting shoes, as you can see, the sole is not grippy at all. So your foot might slide and you might lose first positioning, but also strength strength from the leg drive. So that's actually why I personally wanted my brand to have a pair of those. It's because the sole is grippy and your feet are just cemented into the floor, and in order to produce a lot of force with your leg drive, it's so much better. But also they can be very helpful, especially for sumo deadlifts, because with sumo it's pretty much the same as the bench press. You're really pushing into the ground, creating those like lateral or frontal motions. And if your shoes are not non-slippery, you might be slipping, whether it's in training, whether it's on the competition platform. So that's why those are very helpful. And for me, they're in the A tier for that reason. So obviously any pair of grippy sleeper will be in the A tier. It doesn't have to be Sandalwalker. It doesn't have to be my own brand's sleepers. But if you do want to support your boy, make sure you try those out. But definitely a pair of grippy sleeper is a must for any serious powerlifter. And that's why I have them in the A tier. Now, lower in the B tier, we have the powerlifting singlet. So, contrary to the belts or the knee sleeves, the singlet doesn't actually give you any real support. So, why is it still in the B tier and not, for instance, the C tier or D tier or whatever? It's because, in my opinion, when you're practicing a sport, you want to use the required equipment of the sport. Like I said in the intro of this section, the powerlifting singlet is mandatory in any competition. You have to have a singlet, otherwise you're not good to compete. So that's why I still had it in the B tier, because in the same fashion as a basketball player wants to play with a basketball short and not a jean, for instance, because it will recreate better circumstances of movements, and that will be better for his training and also for its competitions. And that's the same with powerlifting. So that's why most of the time you see me train in a singlet. It's because I want to replicate the circumstances I'll be under when I compete. And squatting with a very, very wide short and squatting with a tight singlet, in terms of feeling, it's not quite the same. So that's why I do recommend the singlet still, although it's not like as supportive as some other equipments can be, like, you know, the shoes, the wrist straps, the sleepers, any other equipment I presented so far, but still worth thinking about it, especially if you're a competitive powerlifter. If you're not a competitive powerlifter, then, you know, probably don't bother to buy a singlet. But if you are a competitive powerlifter, you know, you don't have a choice because you'll have to wear a singlet in comp. And I think having a couple of singlets and be able to train in them, especially as you get closer to your comp, could be interesting. So make sure you still give it a thought. Finally, we finish at the last position of this equipment tier list, and we're finishing with the elbow sleeves. So just as the knee sleeves, that a pair of sleeve in order to support your elbow joint, especially for pressing motion. So it can be bench press, but also like overhead press, military press, whatever. Those are meant to give you the same style of support than the knee sleeves, but for the elbows. So if it's as good as the knee sleeves in terms of support, why is it much lower in the tier list? And the reason is pretty straightforward, is although the knee sleeves and every other equipment I presented you so far is accepted in competition, so you can use those equipment in competitions, for the elbow sleeves, they're not allowed in a powerlifting competition. So in my opinion, if you're really relying on those in order to feel good, feel strong, to have good training sessions, to have good PRs, whatnot, and then on the midday, the day of your competition, you can't rely on those because they're not allowed, you may end up having some unpleasant surprises. So although I do believe in terms of just the equipment, they're very useful. If they were allowed in powerlifting, I would probably put them in the same tier as the knee sleeves, but since they're not allowed, that's why I have them at the lowest of my tier list, and that's why I don't recommend you use those unless you have some instances where you do need those, like for instance on some squats, low bar squats, because then otherwise it just hurts your elbows, stuff like that. Why not do some training sessions occasionally with those, but don't rely too much on those, because again, on the day of the competition, you won't be able to use it. Now, if you're not a competitive powerlifter, just as I would say don't bother buying a singlet, I would say do bother buying these, because I think they will be very useful, especially for some bench press. For some of you guys that do low bar squat, could be very, very helpful in order to manage your upper body joint fatigue. So that was it for the equipment. I think it was a pretty thorough analysis. If you do have some specific questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section. I personally will answer, or I'm sure some other people of your community will answer for you guys. But here is from top to end what I do recommend you invest in. And you know, again, you can start powerlifting on a very, very low budget. But then if you want to maximize your growth in the sport, that's worth giving some of those equipments a thought. The next part will be about some general rules within powerlifting. So let's say you're now fully engaged, you do want to compete. I just wanted to give you a general idea of what you should expect in a powerlifting competition, especially in terms of movements rules. So what is to avoid during a squat, what is to do during a squat in order to have your lift accepted by the referees. And just that section could be an hour-long video. Again, with the programming, we could have another hour. With some other stuff, we could have an hour. So keep in mind, it will be general recommendations, just the most general stuff, and in order for you to have a pretty substantial understanding of the powerlifting world and make sure you start your journey correctly in 2025. So without further ado, let's see the rules of powerlifting. I personally compete in the IPF, which is the best federation for tested lifters. In the IPF, you have a 2-hour weigh-in, so it means that you're being weighed in 2 hours prior to your comp. So in terms of body weight management, that reduces a lot the risk of crazy weight cuts. So just keep in mind, if you do want to compete in the IPF, you'll have 2 hours between the moment you weigh in and the moment you're doing your first squat on the platform. We have 8 categories in powerlifting. You'll see them right now on the screen. So 8 for men, 8 for women. And we also do have age categories. So you have the sub-juniors, you have the juniors, the open, and then master, master 2, and so on and so forth. So the athletes will be ranked in depending on their weight, but also age categories. Now, in terms of movements, the first movement in any powerlifting competition is the squat. For the squat, you have 2 styles of squats that are allowed in a competition. Number 1, you have the high bar squat, where the bar is resting on your traps. And then number 2, you have the low bar squat, where the bar is resting on your rear delt. In general, I would recommend you do low bar squat and not high bar squat in competition, because usually most people are stronger with the low bar squat. I talked about it briefly before, and I do have a tutorial on that again, which will be linked. But most of the time, the high bar squat places a higher demand on your knee extension aspect, so your quads, but also your spinal erectors. Whereas the low bar squat has a much more balanced stress, which will be placed also on the knees and your spinal erectors, but also on the posterior chain, where you'll have your adductors, where you'll have your glutes, you'll have your hamstrings, which are much bigger muscle groups. And usually that's the reason as to why people are stronger with the low bar squat. Now, the high bar squat is still a very useful tool to train. To me, that's one of the best squat variations you can do. And again, like I said, if that's the variation and accessories is a topic you're interested in, make sure to let me know in the comments. But keep in mind, in competition, you'll probably be strong with the low bar than you would be with the high bar, and that's why I recommend the low bar for comps. Now, in terms of rules you have to follow, you have 3 main rules to follow for a squat. First, you have to be upright at the beginning and at the end of your movement. If you're not standing upright enough, either at the beginning or at the end, it will be considered as a fault by the referees. Once you're standing upright with your knees locked and your hips locked, the central ref will give you the start command. From this moment, you're allowed to lower yourself, but there's something in competition called the depth, and you have to make sure you hit depth in order to have your movement accepted by the referees. The rule is simple. The top surface of your legs at your hip joint has to be lower than the top surface of your knees. To put it up simply, let's say you just have to break parallel in order to make sure your squat is a good lift in any powerlifting competition. Once you've hit depth, you then have to come back up, lock out your knees, your hips, and at this moment, the central referee will give you rack and you can replace the bar on the squat rack. In terms of what does it mean for your training sessions, I would say you have to make sure the upright position at the beginning and at the end of your squat is just second nature. So when you unrack the bar, make sure you're able to stand still upright for a solid 2 seconds and make sure you're able to do the same at the end of your training repetitions. In terms of depth, so that's a controversial topic, I would say, because some people are like, oh no, I don't need to hit depth, but depth will be there on midday, and some people are on the opposite, like crazy strict about depth, like, oh, if you don't hit depth, it doesn't count, blah, blah, blah. I would say you should hit depth in training most of the time. When I say most of the time, it's like 90% and above. Hitting depth, if you're not like built for that, is required in order to have a technical repeatability. So for instance, you have a lifter, let's say when he goes down, he doesn't hit depth and he just simply repeats that pattern. On midday, he won't really be able to repeat a pattern where he hits depth because that's not the pattern that he trained for. So that's pretty much this idea. So you should most of the time, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, train while hitting depth. One last one, usually you don't have to think a lot about this one, but like I said, you have to be able to stand upright at the beginning, at the end. And again, remember, standing upright means your hips, but also your knees. So make sure you're able to lock your knees prior to squatting and after finishing your squat sessions. Onto the bench press. So that's pretty much the same as squats. On the bench press, you have to be able to assess a given position in order for the central ref to give you the start command. And this position is pretty straightforward. You have to have your head, your butt against the bench. So you cannot have the start position and you cannot lift like in a bench press with either the head or the butt off the bench. And also you have to have your foot, especially your heels, onto the ground. So that's a rule in the IPF. I know some other feds allow for just the toes on the ground and not the heels, but in the IPF you have to have the whole foot, which means the toes, but also the heels onto the ground. Once you're in this position with your elbow straight, then the central ref will give you the start command. From this moment, you can lower the bar until it touches your chest. So you have to be able to touch your chest with the bar. And once you've touched your chest with the bar, you have to stabilize it. What does it mean is the bar has to be still. It doesn't have to move. So if you're at the bottom and you're moving from left to right, normally that doesn't count as a pause in the powerlifting rulebook. So make sure you're able to stabilize the bar at the bottom. Once you're there, the central referee will give you the press command, which means you're good to go. And then from there, you push the bar back up, making sure you're locking out your elbows to mean you finished the repetition. From there, the central ref will give you the rack command and you can put the barbell back on the bench rack. Some things to consider for your bench press, especially in training. Like I said, just same as squat, you have to be able to be comfortable and have a given position be second nature to you. And that position is head on the bench, butt on the bench, foot slightly cemented into the ground, toes, heels, and also have the elbows extended at the top. What I personally do is I unrack the bar, lock my elbows, stabilize the position for a good second, and then I start my motion, because then when I step foot on the platform, I don't have to think about all of that. It's just second nature to me. I know I have to unrack the bar, I know how to lock my elbows, I know how to wait for the ref to give me the start command, and so on and so forth. For another aspect, and to me that's as crucial as depth is for squat, it's the bench press pause. In competition, like I said, you have to be able to pause the bar when it enters contact with your chest. And just as the squat, if you're not able to stabilize and pause still the bar at the bottom, you are missing out on technique, but also on strength. So in order to make sure this doesn't become a weakness for your bench press in competition, you have to be able to train that in the gym. So whenever you're bench pressing, make sure you pause the bar on your chest. Now, it's just same as squats. You don't have to become crazy strict about it. Like, let's say you're doing sets of 6 and you're like pausing 2 seconds on every rep. It doesn't have to go up to that extreme. But whenever you're doing heavy bench press sessions, especially sessions where you're like, okay, because I hit that in training, I can like project myself hitting that on the platform, you have to make sure there's a sort of pause on that. So what I would recommend is on the higher reps sets on the bench press, you're not forced to pause like very, very strict, all of those. But on the lower rep, especially like practice singles, make sure you're properly pausing every rep. There's another thing that could be very interesting is doing some 2 seconds, 3 seconds pause at the bottom. So that's a variation. Again, like I said, variations are very important for powerlifting. But yeah, having some variations where you're pausing like really, really lengthy, that's a hard word to say in English, lengthy. It's like prerequisite, lengthy. Make sure you're pausing lengthily your reps with the 2 seconds, 3 seconds pause bench press. Finally, with the butt on the bench press. So some people don't really understand the leg drive, and that's why the butt comes off the bench, because if you do understand well the leg drive, your butt shouldn't come off the bench, but having the butt come off the bench can sometimes be helpful in order to complete the reps. So make sure you're not relying too much on those, because in competitions, so I don't know if we'll find images to show you guys, but sometimes in competitions, the reps are actually like that. And so if your bench moves like this much, which you can probably see from where you are, from where the camera is, but if it moves this much, it's like a complete no lift in competitions. And I don't critique any of that, it's just how it is. One good way to assess that is record yourself from the side from time to time when you're doing your bench press, so you can really have this view on your butt and does it come off the bench or not. Rather learn it in training, be able to account for that and do some changes, rather than learning late in comp where you can't do anything about it and you probably won't be able to have your bench press accepted by the referees. Now onto the last movement, which is the deadlift. So same as squats, on deadlifts you have 2 styles that are accepted in powerlifting competitions, the conventional and the sumo. Obviously, I know the sumo is cheating, blah, 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 is a very, very hot topic on the internet, and I don't want to interact and engage on that topic. What I will say is sumo does have some strengths that the conventional doesn't have. One of those strengths being you can have your hips much closer to the bar, which has a much better leverage for the movement. So if you have a good hip mobility, you have a good external rotation at the hip, I do recommend you give sumo a go because it will probably be stronger and feel much easier for you than the conventional would. Now, I just want to say that, but you don't have to pull sumo in order to become a good powerlifter. You don't have to pull sumo in order to become a world champion. Like in my case, I don't pull sumo, and I'm in a weight class where 99% of the lifters do pull sumo because on the lower weight classes, usually people are a bit more flexible. And despite that, I was able to win twice in 2021 and 2023. Now, when it comes to the competition, whenever the timer goes, you have 1 minute to get on the platform and complete the lift. You don't have to wait for any signal by the ref, contrary to the squat where you have to wait for the signal, and the bench press also. On deadlifts, you don't have any signal. Whenever your name is called, you're good to go, get on the platform and pull with however long you want. Just know you have 1 minute to start pulling on the bar. Once you've finished the rep, you have to lock out your shoulders, your hips, but also your knees. So whether it's sumo conventional, you have to lock all of those in order to complete your lift in competition. Once it's done, the central ref will give you the down command, and that's the signal where you can lower the bar until it touches the ground. Be careful, you're not allowed to drop the bar. So if you finish the rep but you drop it at the end, it will be a no lift. So you can lower the bar as fast as you want, but it doesn't have to leave the contact of your hand. So you just lower it. You can slam it if you want, but just keep your hands in contact with the bar until it touches the ground. Now, in powerlifting competitions, the use of straps is forbidden, which means you can resort to hook grip or a mixed grip. Make sure you're not relying on straps in order to deadlift heavy. I did a recent video about it, it will be probably here, but if you're just using straps all the time and then on midday you can't use straps, you'll be lost. It will be very, very hard to create a grip strength or a grip technique that you didn't train properly in the weeks and months prior to your competition. So that's for me is one of the biggest things when training for powerlifting, especially for deadlifts. Make sure you're not relying too much on straps. If you do want to use the straps occasionally, let's say your hand is very, very hurtful at a given moment, let's say you tore a callus, your hand is bleeding, whatnot, yeah, obviously you can use the straps on given sessions, but don't rely solely on the straps, especially if you want to lift heavy, and don't rely on those for your heavy singles or whatnot. Make sure you're able to either hook grip or mixed grip your heavy sets in order to be properly prepared for your competition. So that was it for the competition and rules part. I just wanted to finish with the general ideas, general recommendations, and especially some things that helped me personally a lot when I went from like a gym bro to competitive powerlifter and then world champion. I talked about it in the intro, but to me, one of the biggest strengths of powerlifting is it's, again, an easy sport to start. You don't have to have started the sport at 8 years old or 10 years old in order to become just good, but to become one of the best. We have so many examples of athletes starting very early and not having great careers in the long run, and also some very, very good examples of athletes starting very late and then becoming world champion. I talked about my example where I started at 22, became world champion. I have another example in mind with Leah Bavoil, which is a friend of mine, which some of you may know as Leah Powerlift on Instagram. But Leah started a year before me. So she started also at 22 because she's a year older, but she started at 22. And she also became 2 times world champion and one of our current best female athletes regarding the weight classes. So it's possible, you can do it. What it just requires is if you like the sport and that's a sport that interests you and you do want to learn everything about the squat, the bench, the deadlift, how to refine your techniques, how to refine your programming, all of that, you can become very, very strong. And I really wanted to emphasize that because we also have the example lately of athletes in their like late 30s that are becoming world champions in very competitive weight classes. We have the example of Jorin Skengamu, who won worlds this year in the 83 kilo weight class, which is like a very, very competitive weight class in the men's side, and he's in his mid to late 30s. So it's doable. You don't have to start the sport very, very young. You can start like in your mid-20s, still become very strong. And I would say you can even start in your 30s and still become probably a world-class level lifter. So keep in mind, that's the biggest strength on the sport and don't overlook that. Another tip I have is don't put limits on yourself. I'll give you a quick idea that I have in mind. Imagine you're starting the sport right now. You're a 74 kilo lifter. You're pretty good. You squat like 160, which is, I would say, pretty good for a 74 kilo lifter, especially someone who's starting out the sport. And then you go on social media and you see some 74 kilo lifters squatting 260 kilos, squatting 270, 280 kilos. And you're like, oh, there's no way, I have no chance. And although I do understand this idea, I would say it's the same with everything. Like if you're new to drawing, for instance, and you're like at your 10th hour of drawing, and then you look at some things on social media, you'll see crazy pieces of art. And you're like, oh, there's no way. Yeah, there's no way right now. But if you train for months, for years, then maybe there's a way. But right now, of course, there's no way, because those people that you see at that level, they didn't start a year before. They didn't start 6 months ago. They started 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years prior to that. So if you're interested in powerlifting, understand that there are layers to becoming stronger. It doesn't happen in 6 months. Although it can happen very fast, sometimes it also takes time. I gave my example because, again, that's the example I know the best, right? I started at 22. It took me 5 years to become a powerlifting world champion. So imagine if after starting at 22, by 24, I wasn't at the world level again. If I would have said, oh, I'm not at the world level, I will never get there, so might as well stop, I would never have become a world champion. So keep in mind, yeah, there's probably a huge gap between you starting right now and the top level of your weight class, regardless of the weight class. But, you have to start. You have to practice the sport. You have to train for weeks, for months, for years, and then if you could be good at the sport or not. So that will be my advice. Don't put limits that don't exist on yourself. What you should put on yourself is expectations, and make sure you're able to create like short-term, mid-term, long-term expectations. Don't just look at the higher top level athletes and be like, short-term, I want to be there. No, that's probably your long-term. Short-term is, okay, I'm squatting right now 160. If I do 180, I may qualify for nationals. Okay, let's push to 180. That's your short to midterm goal. And then midterm is, I want to be top 5 at nationals. Okay, cool. You train for that. And then, have these, sequences in a year, because if your only goal is, I'll become world champion, and I think that's a good goal to have. When I started, I had that goal. I still had layers that then led me to my goal. Because if you only have that goal, because it's so far away, you can't see how much closer you're getting. So having smaller goals you can just tick on the way up is the way to go. My final advice would be, I think it's probably the most underrated advice. Powerlifting is an individual sport. Yes, I know that and I agree on that. But if you look at some of the best powerlifters, they always practice the sport almost as the team sport. So in my example, I'm training with like 10, 15 athletes almost every day. And we all are alone when we're doing our motions, our movements. But there's like this general environment that's like just pushes us upward. And the crazy thing is, in my gym where I train, we're 3 world champions. And it's not like we all became world champions and then started training together. It's we started training together years before we became world champions. We started training together with Leah in 2018. We both became world champions in 2021, so 3 years prior. And with Tiffany, she probably, I think, joined around 2019, 2020, and then we became world champions afterwards. And for me, it's not a coincidence. It's because when we were training together, we had this very, very high expectation of each other. When Tiffany was squatting, Leah and myself were watching, having high expectations for her, the same with Leah, the same with myself. So I would say is try to find a gym where first powerlifting is allowed, because some gyms don't allow it. If your gym doesn't allow powerlifting, find another gym. Pretty straightforward. But once you found a gym that allows powerlifting, try to find training partners, because those training partners, if they're good-spirited like you, then it will just be this whole environment of pushing each other up, and you'll be much stronger down the line than if you were to train alone. Now, obviously, you can train alone. You can become very, very strong alone. We all know some good athletes, some even like the best athletes that do train alone. And I don't want to say you can't make it to the top while training alone. But I want to say that training with an environment, training with a crew is a very good way to get to the top, probably a bit faster than if you were to train completely alone. And I think that without this whole idea, without this own feeling that I had and I wanted to always push myself, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish what I have accomplished so far in powerlifting, and what I also will accomplish in the future, because it's not done. It's not done. So that's how I wanted to start 2025 with this video for you guys. So I think it was a pretty lengthy video, but I just wanted to go over some general things that, you could have in mind to how you can actually start powerlifting. So 2025, guys, I have some things that I want to do for myself and I want to challenge you to do is push yourself to become stronger. Train harder, find those gym partners like I talked about, whether they're physically with you, but also remotely on social media where you can then exchange and have good conversations about that. But yeah, powerlifting is a sport where you need to train hard, train with intent in order to grow, in order to become strong. But I think that's a sport that a lot of people can actually become very good at. So don't waste any time. 2025 is the year to start. And I hope this tutorial, this guide was helpful. If that's the case, it was a lot of work writing the script down, editing for my camera guy. So the best way you can support is make sure you leave a comment, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like this video. And like I said, I have a lot more to come in 2025 on this English channel. So make sure you follow to not miss any of that. Guys, we're all going to train our asses off this year, so it has already started.